The evening the world shifted felt like it had been waiting for a long sigh to be released, the sky bruised with copper and lavender as though the day wanted to confess something before it died, and Colt Mercer, age 30, rode through that fading light with the weight of winters buried behind his ribs, unaware that the wind was about to carry him toward a stranger who would unmake that loneliness in ways he could not yet imagine, though he felt a strange prickle of anticipation as his horse slowed near a dying emberglow by the riverbank, as if urging him to stop and listen to something only horses and herding men can sense when the dusk grows tender. A small fire crackled in front of a lone figure wrapped in a worn blanket, and as Colt approached, the shape lifted its head, revealing the young but ancient still eyes of Ayanna Redbird, age 20, who watched him with the quietness of someone who had been stared at too many times and expected nothing good to come of being seen, though her gaze flickered with something fragile when the wind shifted and illuminated her features in the trembling firelight. He dismounted slowly, dust swirling around his boots like the spirits of old tracks he'd walked before, the saddle creaking in a familiar song that reminded him of long, empty nights, and he cleared his throat as though greeting a stranger required courage he'd forgotten he owned, yet he somehow felt she was bracing for him to turn away first, as if she had lived a lifetime of goodbyes before ever hearing a welcome. "I don't mean trouble," he said gently, palms open, and the smoke drifted between them like a question neither could voice, while Ayanna lowered her eyes not in fear but in something like learned resignation, the kind that forms when the world teaches a person to shrink even when they are not small, though she held her chin at a steady angle that suggested she still carried a stubborn ember of dignity beneath her quiet. She nodded once, shifting closer to the fire as though trying to decide whether to trust his warmth or retreat into the shore's shadows, and Colt felt the oddest tug in his chest, a sensation that had been dormant since his wife's passing 2 winters ago, yet he could not understand why this stranger's silence made him want to sit down beside her and unravel every distance that had ever lived between 2 human hearts. The moon rose slowly as he set up camp a careful distance away, each crackle of his own fire mirroring the fragile peace settling between them, though every so often he caught Ayanna glancing over, not with suspicion but with a longing she kept trying to swallow, a longing that made him wonder who had taught her to expect abandonment long before trust could bloom. Come morning, he found her by the river, gathering water with hands that trembled only when she noticed him watching, and something in her expression said she feared she'd overstayed her welcome, though Colt felt the opposite, that something about her presence softened the lonely edges of dawn in a way he didn't know he'd needed until he saw her standing there, half shadow, half blessing, waiting for judgment. When they rode into Sagebrush Crossing together, whispers sparked like struck flint, with Maeve Caldwell narrowing her eyes from her porch as though Colt had betrayed some unwritten rule of belonging, and Ayanna lowered her gaze, shoulders tightening with the memory of voices that had once named her outsider before they bothered to know her name, though Colt stepped closer in quiet defiance, feeling his blood warm with the instinct to shield her from the weighted stares. Sheriff Thorne watched from behind the hitching rail, tapping his hat in a gesture that seemed polite but measured, as though assessing whether Colt was bringing danger or possibility into town, and Ayanna whispered to Colt that she could leave if he wished, her voice barely louder than the dust skittering across the ground, though the tremor beneath her words made him wonder what kind of life had trained her to offer disappearance more readily than hope. That evening near his wagon they shared a small fire, its glow softening the sharp lines etched by their respective losses, and Ayanna spoke first, her words slow and careful like stones placed on sacred soil, telling him, "I'm not the woman you'd choose, but I can give you a life you never expected," her eyes reflecting both courage and sorrow, as though revealing her worth was an act of rebellion against the ghosts that still tugged at her spirit. Colt stared into the flames, wrestling with a heart that had been cracked but not shattered, remembering the promises he'd whispered to his late wife, the guilt that clung to him like dust, yet feeling a pull toward Ayanna that was not born of impulse but of recognition, the kind that forms when 2 wanderers sense the same hollowed-out ache inside each other. Though he feared that allowing such a feeling to grow might betray the grief, he still carried like a faded brand. She held a small medicine pouch close to her chest, fingers tracing it as if it guarded something sacred, and Colt felt a spark of curiosity. What memories were protected inside such a small object, and what story lay curled behind her guarded silence? Yet he did not ask, sensing she was offering him her presence long before she could offer her past. Before he could gather the words forming behind his ribs, thunder rolled across the plains, the sky darkening as though the world itself was bracing for something to break open, and they rushed to secure the horses as the storm swallowed the horizon with sheets of silver rain, though Colt's breath hitched when Ayanna grabbed his arm and steered him toward higher ground with an instinct that spoke of survival rather than fear. Rain lashed their faces as they battled the rising water, the river swelling with a fury that seemed determined to take everything not anchored by courage or faith, and Ayanna's strength emerged like quiet lightning when she guided a panicking mare to safety, her hair plastered to her face, her voice steady in the chaos, reminding Colt of the grace that exists only in those who've learned to weather storms alone, though he noticed a jagged scar on her arm when the lightning flashed, hinting at a history carved deeper than flesh. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and trembling air, Colt looked at her differently, not as someone fragile or uncertain, but as someone forged in the kind of fire that makes a person capable of building a life with honesty and grit, though she quickly turned her face away as if fearing that being seen too clearly might unravel the fragile shelter she'd built around her heart. In the days that followed, their connection unfurled through small acts rather than grand gestures, with Ayanna mending his broken stirrup leather at dawn while Colt left her a tin cup of fresh coffee each morning, both pretending these acts were mere convenience though each one felt like a thread stitching their quiet companionship into something sturdier. And yet they said little of what grew between them, as though speaking too soon might startle the tenderness taking root. Once, while working near the mule pen, they laughed unexpectedly when a stubborn mule nudged Colt into a water trough, the sound of their laughter rising like a fragile bloom between two long-withered seasons, but they fell silent afterward, almost startled by the joy they'd allowed themselves, and Colt noticed Ayanna touching her cheek where her smile had briefly lived, as if uncertain whether she deserved such warmth. Colt began carving a small wooden bird in the evenings, shaping its wings with a devotion he couldn't explain, hiding it whenever Ayanna approached, yet he sensed she knew something was being created for her, not because he said anything, but because she watched his hands the way someone watches a sunrise they fear might disappear before they fully understand its meaning. Despite the growing softness between them, the past still clung to Colt like a second skin, and one gray morning he rode alone to the grave of his late wife, Mara, letting the silence settle heavy around him as he confessed aloud that he felt both disloyal and alive in Ayanna's presence, a contradiction that tore through him like competing storms, though deep down he sensed Mara would not want him to live half a life out of guilt. As he knelt in that quiet cemetery, a soft feather drifted onto the ground beside him, delicate, white-tipped, unmistakably from Ayanna's pouch, and he wondered if she had left it as a blessing or an apology, a gesture or a prayer, though he could not be sure what she meant by it until he returned to camp and found her gone. He found her eventually by the river, her posture folded inward as if trying to make herself small enough to disappear, and she told him in a voice stripped bare that she'd overheard townsfolk whispering that her presence was a stain on him, that a man like him deserved a woman with a clean history, not someone who carried scars and stories better left buried, and Colt felt something fierce rise inside him, a protective instinct that surprised him with its depth. She revealed then that the scar on her arm came from saving a child during a raid that shattered her community, a child she could not save despite her courage, and she believed this failure marked her as unworthy of happiness, unworthy of peace, unworthy of being chosen, though Colt saw only a heart more courageous than any he'd known, forged in loss yet still capable of tenderness. Her voice cracked when she said she should leave before she brought him more shame, and she turned to go, but Colt reached out and caught her hand, not with possession, but with plea, and she froze as though the simple act of being held was something she had forgotten how to accept, though her breath hitched in a way that suggested she longed to lean into it. "I don't want you to leave," he said softly, not as a declaration but as truth spoken like an offering, telling her his world felt quieter when she was near and warmer in ways that awakened parts of him he thought grief had destroyed forever, though he chose his words carefully, not wanting to push her into shadows she had only begun to step out from. They agreed to marry not out of desperation or rebellion but out of an unspoken recognition that their lives had begun to interlace in ways neither had intended but both were willing to nurture. Their decision whispered beneath the hush of dawn as though acknowledging something sacred that had grown quietly in the spaces between words. The ceremony took place in the early morning light, gentle and unadorned, with Sheriff Thorne officiating in a voice softened by respect, Maeve Caldwell watching from afar with folded arms, and Ayanna wearing a simple beaded ribbon in her hair that caught the sun like a small rebellion against a lifetime of shadows, though Colt's hands trembled when she placed hers in his, feeling the enormity of choosing life again after so much sorrow. When they kissed, the wind rose lightly around them as if circling their new beginning with a blessing whispered by the land itself, though Colt felt a flicker of fear. Hope was a fragile thing to cradle after grief, and love even more so, but the warmth of Ayanna's fingers laced with his steadied him in ways he was still learning to name. That night beneath a quilt of stars, Colt gave her the wooden bird he'd carved, its wings outstretched as though eternally mid-flight, and Ayanna held it with reverence, telling him she had always believed she was meant to wander without belonging, but with him she felt roots forming, gentle, patient, real, though she spoke the words as if afraid they might crumble once released. They promised each other quiet loyalty rather than grand passion, knowing two wounded hearts must learn to beat in slow, careful tandem, and Ayanna whispered a blessing in her native tongue, one Colt didn't understand but felt deep in his bones, a promise of protection and hope spoken like a sunrise held between cupped hands, though her voice quivered as if afraid to believe in such brightness fully. She rested her head on his shoulder, confessing in a breath no louder than the rustle of night grass that happiness frightened her because it could be taken as quickly as it came, and Colt pressed a kiss to her hair, swearing not through vows but through presence that he would not let her face such fear alone, though even he wondered how one protects something as tender as newfound joy. And so their first night ended quietly, two souls who had weathered storms settling into a peace they never expected, the darkness around them soft rather than hollow, as if the universe itself was holding its breath in gentle anticipation of the life they would build, though the future remained a horizon both beautiful and unknown. If you've ever felt unworthy of the gentleness approaching your life, remember this. Sometimes love does not arrive with thunder or certainty but with a quiet knock at the edge of your loneliness, asking only that you open the door a little wider, though the courage to do so is a story every heart must write for itself.